Alright guys, welcome back to another project. For this one we're going to be building another settle, but this one I wanted to build out of white oak. So after the success of the first settle that you guys saw me build on this channel, I wanted to build one out of white oak. I've put off working with white oak for a long time, but in this project I finally wanted to do it. So for the legs here, I wasn't able to get 8/4 stock, so I'm using a slightly more complicated method of making wide square legs by milling up 4 individual pieces with beveled edges, gluing them together into a square piece of stock. Now this is a lot more expensive than just using 8/4, but in this case I had to do it because I wanted legs that were a little wider than I could have gotten out of 8/4 stock, and just the fact that I couldn't get 8/4 stock to begin with. So I would say that this method works very well, and it looks super cool, and I do something very cool at the end of the video that you guys get to see. But just be warned that this is a very complex method and can be kind of dangerous. But overall, once you've got the leg blanks glued up, it's no different than dealing with just solid wood. You just cut everything down to length, and you can plane it and mill it all the same way. The next step was to get all of my stretchers cut to size, so all my side stretchers are the same length, and all my lengthwise stretchers are the same length, so I just set up a stop block. For the long ones I had to attach a piece of wood to the extension table that I built, and this would just act as, well, a kind of rudimentary stop block for these super long pieces. And so the important thing here is that all your pieces start as the same size. That way when you go to cut your tenons and all that, they are easily matched all throughout all your different pieces. And so I started out by planning to do the mortises on these legs. I was going to do them all by hand, just like I did on that first settle you guys saw me build. So I started by drilling out the holes, and I quickly found that going out and buying a router would make this much easier. So I went out and picked up this Bosch Plunge router, and now this is a really nice one. It's got the electronic trigger on the grip, so it's a lot safer, a lot more fun to use, and was very much so worth the purchase. I've used it on a few different projects now, and I have to say this is probably one of my favorite tools I've bought so far, just because it's so simple to use. Then I decided to go with kind of a different method with the tenons, so I started by marking a line on the table saw and then cutting to that line on the bandsaw. This was a lot easier than other methods I've tried in the past because it gave me 2 very easily square parallel shoulders. And so same thing here to make the lines on the long pieces. I just use that kind of basic stop block. And so with the outer faces cut to size, I tuned them up with the router plane and then went in and squared up the mortises to match the tenons. Now I found this to be easier rather than rounding the tenons. You'll see later on that on some of the tenons I did round the edges, but I found that with my 1/2-inch mortise and chisel I was able to cut right through the white oak fairly easily and get pretty much all of a perfect fit. It was quite nice to work with. And so this is where white oak really shined. The tenons were super easy to get nice, square, and straight, and when I ended up hammering this thing together, everything held super strong. Now here you can see one of the rounded tenons. It took a lot more effort to round the tenons, so if you're going to use this method of using a router, I highly suggest just squaring off the mortise with a good mortising chisel. And so then I went in through and drilled in the draw boring dowel holes. So for all of these pieces, they're going to be draw bored. So basically all that means is that I put the whole thing together, clamp it under really good pressure, then I move the hole on the tenon back towards the shoulder. I think it was about a 1/16 of an inch. And so all my mortises overlap with each other, so I decided to do this method of putting a miter on the end of the tenon. Now this worked really well. They all line up, the gap on the inside, the mortise on the inside is just fully filled, and it looks super cool. So it's one of those kind of hidden facts that you'll never really get to know about. And then it was on to working with the detail bits. So the top rail has a little slight curve to it, and so does the bottom front and back rail. So for the bottom rail, it's just a straight curve across. So you can see I'm using a drawing bow here to mark up my lengths. And then for the top, side, and back rails, I use these templates from the first settle that I built. And so I had to modify it a little bit to get it to work with these smaller side pieces. And you can see here, it wasn't super complicated. I just marked down to a depth that I wanted and to the center point, and then drew my lines so that they would meet up in the middle there. And then once I had it drawn out, I went over to the bandsaw. Now this is a great way to do this, and I'm using a 5/8 blade here, so if you are willing to change out, I'm a little bit lazy and didn't swap out to my 1/4 inch blade, because getting around those corners would have been a heck of a lot easier with a 1/4 inch blade, but the 5/8 blade worked just fine, and yeah, so I just hogged out most of the waste on the bandsaw, and then finished it off on my oscillating spindle sander. And so once I had one done, I could make it so that the curve matched on the second one by tracing it. And then same thing, I finished all of them off on the oscillating spindle sander. So this is the back rail that I'm working, the top back rail I'm working on now. And then because I wanted the bottom rails, the front and back bottom rails to match perfectly, I stuck them together with double-sided tape and just kind of worked on them all at once. And this worked very well to get nice consistent looks between the two of them. And then finished it off with some hand sanding. Now you can see here I'm using just a hickory block to kind of do a finish sanding. Because hickory is harder than white oak, it ended up putting this really nice sheen over the white oak surface. So I worked it down to 220 grit and then finished it off with just rubbing the hickory block on it. Then I can start working on the back slats. So just like the last settle I built, I wanted to go with walnut back slats just to add a little bit of contrast. And so the back slats are nice, easy things to work on. They slide into a little 1/4 inch groove I cut in the back rails. And so I just wanted to go through, round off the corners, and you can see I used a little bit of that little cove profile bit that I have, just to get them looking a little bit more detail on top. And so then to top off the legs, I made these little walnut pieces. And so all these legs have that kind of hollow square on the inside. Now, I couldn't figure out how to fill it, so I figured that this would probably be the best way to do it. I had an idea to add a tapered point to the top of the legs, and I figured adding in a contrasting wood like walnut would just look super cool. So I glued in this blank and then cut the angle on my tenon jig on my table saw. And this ended up looking super cool. It all blended together completely seamlessly. The little small gaps that were there, I filled with a little bit of sawdust, and you can't even, it looks like one solid piece of wood, but they're two obviously different pieces of wood, so it's kind of just an interesting look overall. And I went for a very heavy rounding on these, on the top parts of the legs anyway, so that there wouldn't be any chance of anyone getting hurt grabbing it or falling on top of it. And then it was time for the glue up. So probably one of the most exciting glue ups I've done. There's a lot of little pieces to get right, but luckily with the draw boring mortise and tenons, I really didn't have to worry about it. There was no clamps involved in this glue up, which made it super easy. Really it was just put a little bit of glue on the tenon and pound in the dowel, and it was all together nice and easy. And then before I put on the sides, I had to make sure to slide in the side slats. Now the three sides of this thing have slats, these walnut slats in them, so it was very important not to forget them. That is a little bit of foreshadowing, I'll just throw that out there. But you can see here just how easy this is together. And for the seat supports, I went with sliding dovetails again. Now, I loved this on the first settle I built. It just had this great strength to it that I loved working with. And so I started by doing the sides and then worked to the back. So with both side assemblies glued up, I could then put on the back. But you'll see in the background of the video here, that pile of walnut slats. That should be inside the piece right about now. Luckily, I was able to catch this on camera. Oh, that was bad. Oh, that was really bad. That would have really sucked. Oh, good catch. Now, to say that that would have been bad would be kind of an understatement. If I'd forgot to put those slats in, I probably would have just thrown this project out. not even joking there. That would have been probably the worst case scenario. But luckily, right at the last moment, I realized that there was a big gap where there shouldn't have been a big gap, and I got those pieces in just in time before the glue started to set up. And so with all the dowels in, I went and used I got this idea to cut the dowels off with this, I don't know what this thing is called, I think it's a multi-tool or something like that, but it has this little bit on it that worked absolutely lovely, way easier than hand sawing them off. And flushed them up with the block plane and random orbit sander. And so you're going to see on this project that I ended up going with the sander a lot more, because white oak is so hard, it was just dulling my planes really quickly. And so once I had everything sanded and planed and cleaned up and ready to go, I went on to doing the upholstery. So I used a little bit of a different method for this one than the first settle. I'm using the exact same foam as last time. It's a 3-inch medium density foam. I'm going to be using the same fabric, same technique, everything. The only thing I'm doing different this time is that I'm not pulling it as tight. You may have noticed on the first one that there was quite a bit of wrinkling and the top edges of the seat cushion just didn't look very consistent. They were a little bit lumpy, a little bit weirdly shaped here and there. I've evened it out since making that, but on this one I figured out what I wanted to do to fix that issue. So the big problem with the reason that was happening was because I was just pulling the fabric a little bit too tight. So on this one, I kept the fabric, I didn't pull it under any kind of tension, I just kind of tacked it in, put a little bit of pressure on the opposite side, and then tacked it down. So it ended up looking a lot better, the lines are a lot cleaner, and just overall it looks and feels, it's much nicer to sit on as well. I also ended up putting the folded part on the sides, which I really like the look of it. I don't know why I didn't do this on the first one, but yeah, it depends on your personal preference, but I do prefer having the folds on the side of the seats. And another thing I did different on this is I used a lot more staples. You can see here I have lines and lines and lines of staples. I wanted to make sure I evened out the pressure all the way along. And so because I have so much fabric sitting around and the specific design of this settle, I wanted it to be very comfortable to sit in. And the only way it would be comfortable to sit in is if you have some nice cushioning on your back. So this is when I had to learn how to make pillows. So whipped out the sewing machine and did my best at it. I can say that. They're very nice pillows, but it took a lot of practice and a day spent with my mom teaching me how to sew a straight line and just generally how to use a sewing machine, because this is something I have never thought about doing before. But now that I know that I can make pillows for my furniture, it'll actually really help in the future, because again, just something as simple as a pillow can really up the value of your furniture pieces. And because I use the same fabric, I think it just carries a consistent look. Plus this fabric looks really great with the walnuts, so overall it really helps the aesthetic of the piece.